The latest data on the US labor market and consumer sentiment paints a troubling picture, one that suggests Americans are growing increasingly anxious about the economy, their jobs, and their personal finances. And this environment of uncertainty is not just reflected in numbers on charts or statements from economists. It is showing up in everyday conversations, in store aisles, at workplace meetings, and in households where budgeting has become an urgent priority rather than an occasional task. Consumer sentiment, which is one of the earliest indicators of how people feel about their financial situation and the broader direction of the economy, has deteriorated sharply. According to the University of Michigan's preliminary November report, consumer sentiment fell to 50.3. This is not a minor shift. It is the lowest level recorded since June of 2022. That period was one many Americans remember quite clearly. Inflation was accelerating. Gas prices were at uncomfortable highs, mortgage rates were rising, and the possibility of a recession was a constant topic in the news cycle. So seeing sentiment fall back to those levels tells us something important. People are once again bracing for economic turbulence. What's behind this sharp drop in confidence? The public is looking at a mix of stressors, each of which alone would be enough to create unease. But combined, they are producing widespread financial anxiety. On one hand, the government shutdown has created uncertainty about public services, federal support, and the stability of policymaking itself. On the other hand, persistent inflation continues to erode purchasing power. And now, there is a new growing concern, a wave of corporate layoffs that is starting to spread across multiple sectors of the US economy. I mentioned this earlier on my Telegram channel, where I share real-time updates and deeper discussions throughout the day. If you would like more on-the-ground economic news and insight, you're welcome to follow there. I post far more frequently than I do here, and it's where these discussions continue without delay. Returning to the survey data, the report found that a measure of current economic conditions fell more than 6 points to 52.3. That is a significant plunge. It means households are already feeling the strain, not anticipating it, but experiencing it. Worries about daily costs, employment security, and long-term financial stability are becoming part of everyday thought for many Americans. And one important detail stands out. This decline in sentiment is not isolated to one demographic group. It is broad-based. Younger Americans, older Americans, lower-income households, upper-income households, and people across the political spectrum all reported similar concerns. When sentiment falls evenly across demographic divides, it signals that the pressures are widespread and structural, not temporary or isolated. This is occurring despite repeated assurances from the White House and Treasury officials. President Trump and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent have made public statements claiming that the US economy is strong, inflation is under control, and growth is stable. But the question that matters most is not what officials say. It is what people are experiencing when they buy groceries, fill their gas tank, pay rent, or look at their credit card bills. And the survey reflects that reality. Consumers are not seeing relief. Spontaneous mentions of price increases have dominated the survey results for 5 consecutive months. That means inflation is not something people are simply reading about. It is something they are feeling directly, repeatedly, and painfully. Expectations for near-term inflation also ticked upward in the same report. This is extremely important. When consumers expect prices to continue rising, their behavior changes. They delay large purchases. They reduce discretionary spending. They save more defensively. And because consumer spending accounts for around 70% of US GDP, these behavior shifts ripple through the economy very quickly. The report also showed that personal financial assessments fell to a 6-year low. That statistic alone tells a larger story. Americans are not just concerned about the national economy, they are concerned about their household economy. And that concern is visible in weakening buying conditions for big-ticket items such as vehicles, appliances, furniture, and electronics. Sales of these items require confidence, stability, and forward-looking optimism. When consumers are uncertain, these categories decline, often quickly and sharply. The survey now shows that these buying conditions are the worst they have been since the middle of 2022, when inflation peaked. This brings us to another deeply worrying finding: expectations about job security. 71% of respondents now expect unemployment to rise in the coming year. That is more than double the percentage reported just 12 months ago. In simple terms, 7 out of 10 Americans believe the job market is going to weaken. And concern about employment can shift the economy faster than almost any other variable. When people are worried about their jobs, they tighten spending immediately, not eventually, immediately. And unfortunately, their fears may not be misplaced. Job cuts across the US economy are accelerating. A report from Challenger, Gray & Christmas revealed that US employers announced more than 153,000 job cuts in October alone. That represents a 175% increase from the same month a year earlier. Such a dramatic year-over-year surge is not something to overlook. Historically, this type of spike in layoffs has often occurred ahead of recessions or periods of economic stagnation. It signals that corporate executives, who must plan ahead, are preparing for slower demand, higher operating costs, and tighter financial conditions. To put this into perspective, US companies have already announced over 1 million job cuts in the first 10 months of 2025. The year is not even finished, and that number is already 45% higher than the total announced job cuts last year. When layoffs become widespread across multiple sectors, it indicates that the economic slowdown is not contained. It is spreading, and the sectors being hit tell us even more. Technology companies are reducing staff after overexpanding during the pandemic. Warehousing and fulfillment are shrinking as consumer demand cools. Retail is cutting jobs, which is particularly revealing, because retail layoffs are almost always linked to slowing consumer spending. Even manufacturing is being affected, which indicates that businesses are pulling back on production in anticipation of weaker future demand. This is not happening in isolation. It is part of a broader economic adjustment that is just beginning to unfold. Technology firms were among the first to announce large-scale layoffs, but they are far from the only ones. The shift in job cuts is moving outward from the tech sector and into industries that represent essential day-to-day economic activity. When layoffs appear in retail, transportation, warehousing, manufacturing, and corporate services, it signals that companies are preparing for a prolonged slowdown, not a temporary adjustment. In other words, they are planning for demand to weaken rather than recover in the near term. And these cuts are not small. They are measured in tens of thousands at a time. Amazon, one of the largest employers in the United States, is eliminating 14,000 positions. That number alone reflects more than just internal restructuring. Amazon is a demand-driven business. When consumer spending slows, Amazon sees it almost immediately in purchasing patterns. So when Amazon cuts jobs, it often means consumers are not buying the way they used to. Similarly, Target is cutting 800 corporate roles. Wholesale and retail chains do not reduce salaried staff unless they anticipate long-term strategic pressure. Salaried corporate cuts are different from seasonal workforce adjustments. Seasonal employees are hired and released based on the holiday cycle or annual retail patterns. Cutting corporate staff means the company is forecasting lower revenue, tighter margins, and reduced growth expectations. It means the slowdown is structural, not temporary. Paramount Skydance, UPS, Starbucks, Delta Airlines, CarMax, these are brands that have been deeply rooted in American consumer and business markets for decades. When companies like these announce workforce reductions, it reflects a shift in the broader economic environment. It means cost pressures are rising faster than expected revenue growth. It means companies are adjusting not just to survive, but to protect future financial stability. They are preparing for uncertainty. The situation is further complicated by the rapid adoption of artificial intelligence across various industries. Businesses are increasingly adapting AI-driven systems to do tasks previously managed by human employees. In some cases, this improves productivity and efficiency. In other cases, it replaces workers entirely. And because AI is evolving faster than most labor markets can adjust, there is a widening gap between the jobs being eliminated and the jobs that are being created. Executives point to AI-driven automation as both an opportunity and a challenge. On one hand, companies are reducing costs by delegating tasks such as customer service, data entry, logistics coordination, and back-end processing to automated systems. On the other hand, workers who previously held these roles are finding it more difficult to transition into new positions because the new roles require different skill sets. Andy Challenger phrased it clearly. He said that sectors are correcting after the hiring boom of the pandemic. But he also warned that the workers being laid off are not finding new roles quickly. This is not simply a matter of layoffs, it is a matter of replacement. Jobs eliminated due to cyclical downturns often return when conditions improve. Jobs eliminated due to technological replacement often do not return at all. That is why workers are beginning to feel something different this time. It is not just the fear of temporary unemployment. It is the fear of skills becoming outdated in real time. And this anxiety is feeding directly into consumer sentiment. When people are worried about the future of their industry, their career, or their ability to adapt to new job requirements, they pull back financially. They spend less, they postpone big purchases, and they prioritize paying down debt. These behaviors show up quickly in economic data, especially in consumer spending metrics. Meanwhile, the government shutdown has created another layer of instability. It is now the longest in US history, and several key agencies remain closed. Typically, when economists or analysts assess the health of the labor market, they rely on official labor reports from federal statistical agencies. These reports offer detailed data on hiring, layoffs, wages, and workforce participation. But with agencies suspended, the traditional data flow has been blocked. That means policymakers, businesses, and financial markets do not have access to the full picture. They are operating with partial visibility. In the absence of official government reporting, economists are relying more heavily on private data from firms like ADP, Challenger Gray and Christmas, and various institutional research groups. But private data is not always collected in the same way as government data. It may focus more heavily on certain sectors, regions, or industries, creating a narrower field of view. So decision makers are trying to evaluate national economic conditions while looking through a narrower lens. This lack of clarity is dangerous because it increases the risk of policy missteps. When central banks and government officials do not have full insight into the labor market, they may make decisions that either tighten or loosen financial conditions at the wrong time. Jerome Powell recently described the labor market as showing very gradual cooling. But many analysts argue that the ground-level reality looks significantly more strained than the official description suggests. And that is exactly what you're telling me in your comments and messages too. People are not experiencing a gradual cooling. They are experiencing price increases, job uncertainty, and reduced financial security. The disconnect between official statements and household experience is widening. And when people feel that institutions are not acknowledging their reality, trust erodes. That erosion of trust is reflected directly in consumer sentiment scores. The US economy is heavily dependent on consumer confidence. Because consumer spending represents such a large share of total economic activity, when confidence falls, the economy slows. And when that slowdown begins, it tends to reinforce itself. Households reduce spending. Businesses see reduced revenue. Companies respond by cutting costs. Those cost-cutting measures often include employee layoffs. The newly unemployed reduce spending even further, and the cycle deepens. This is why consumer sentiment is so closely watched. It is not just a psychological measure, it is a predictive indicator. When people believe a downturn is coming, they begin behaving in ways that cause the downturn to materialize. At this moment, the US economy is at a fragile point. Confidence is weakening. Layoffs are increasing. Inflation remains a persistent pressure. Personal financial strain is rising. And the institutions responsible for stabilizing the economy are operating with limited visibility due to the government shutdown. These forces together are shaping the direction of the economy more than any single headline. And American households are responding by tightening their spending and preparing for uncertainty. The slowdown in consumer spending is not only visible in sentiment surveys and retail data, it is starting to show up in earnings reports from major corporations. Companies that normally report steady demand are now acknowledging that customers are becoming more cautious. They are describing shifts in behavior that indicate people are carefully evaluating every purchase. For example, car dealerships across the country have noted a drop in foot traffic and loan approvals. Rising interest rates have made auto financing substantially more expensive, and households are reconsidering whether they need to replace their vehicles or whether they can keep what they have for a few more years. The same pattern is occurring in the housing market. Higher mortgage rates have locked many Americans out of home ownership, while those who currently own homes are reluctant to move because they do not want to give up lower mortgage rates secured in previous years. As a result, the housing market has slowed, not because people no longer want homes, but because affordability has collapsed. The same affordability crisis extends into everyday living expenses. Groceries, transportation, utilities, and insurance have all risen sharply. While some officials claim wage growth offsets inflation, the reality shown in paycheck to expense ratios tells a different story. Wage growth has been uneven. Many households are now covering essentials with credit cards, and revolving credit balances in the United States recently reached record highs. Credit card interest rates are also at some of the highest levels in decades, meaning people are paying more not just for the goods they buy, but for the debt used to purchase them. This creates a compounding financial burden. When people use credit to fill the gap between their income and their cost of living, they are borrowing against their future. If their income does not grow fast enough to repay that borrowed amount, debt pressure increases. And when millions of households experience this at the same time, the economy becomes more fragile. Meanwhile, companies are responding to these conditions not only by cutting jobs, but also by slowing hiring. Job postings that were once plentiful are now being withdrawn or left unfilled. The hiring freezes being announced across various sectors are often a precursor to additional layoffs. Businesses tend to stop hiring first, evaluate how long the slowdown persists, then make decisions about workforce reductions. What we are seeing now is the first stage of that process playing out in real time. This is why the survey finding showing that 7 out of 10 Americans expect unemployment to rise is particularly significant. Workers are interpreting the signs correctly. The labor market is tightening. The ability to switch jobs easily is declining. Job security is weakening. And because employment stability is one of the most important drivers of financial confidence, we are witnessing the consequences in household spending and sentiment. The effects of this shift are also visible at the corporate strategy level. Businesses are scaling back expansion plans, delaying capital expenditures, and reducing inventory levels. Supply chain orders are slowing. Shipping volume has declined in major ports. Warehousing activity has dropped. These are not mere short-term fluctuations. These are adjustments to a changing economic environment. In past downturns, the US Federal Reserve often responded by cutting interest rates to stimulate demand. But the situation today is complicated by inflation. If the Federal Reserve cuts rates too quickly, inflation could rise again. If it leaves rates too high for too long, economic conditions could worsen and layoffs could accelerate. The central bank is attempting to balance inflation control with economic stability. But the longer inflation remains above comfortable levels, the more prolonged the stress on households becomes. This tension between inflation management and economic support places policymakers in an extremely difficult position. And during the government shutdown, the lack of official labor and economic data makes it even more challenging to determine the right course of action. When decision makers cannot see the full picture, they risk acting either too aggressively or too cautiously. Both outcomes carry real economic consequences. In the middle of these conditions, American households are recalibrating their priorities. Many people are focusing on building emergency savings, paying down high-interest debt, and reducing unnecessary spending. They are prioritizing stability over consumption. This shift in financial behavior is rational given the uncertainty. But it also accelerates the economic slowdown because reduced spending lowers revenue for businesses, prompting further cutbacks and reinforcing the cycle. The emotional impact of these changes should also not be overlooked. Economic stress has a psychological toll. When people feel financially insecure, it affects their health, their relationships, their productivity, and their sense of control. Stress related to job insecurity and rising living costs is now a common topic in workplaces, social circles, and households. And this emotional strain contributes further to the weakening of consumer confidence. People are not only facing financial pressure, they are feeling the weight of uncertainty about the future. Underlying all of this is a broader structural shift. The economy is transitioning into a phase where the assumptions of the past decade, low interest rates, abundant job opportunities, predictable price levels, no longer hold. The environment is more volatile. The path forward is less certain. And this uncertainty is shaping how both consumers and corporations behave. When looking at the landscape as a whole, several themes become clear. People are spending less because they feel less secure. Companies are cutting costs because they expect lower demand. Job markets are tightening because businesses are restructuring. Inflation remains a persistent concern, even if it is lower than previous peaks. And consumer confidence is weakening because people do not believe conditions will improve soon. These dynamics are interacting to slow economic activity across multiple sectors simultaneously. And when several sectors slow together, the impact is magnified. As a result, the United States is approaching a period where economic momentum is not simply easing, it is shifting direction. The question now is not whether people feel the pressure. They clearly do. The question is how deep and how long this economic adjustment will be. The answer will depend on what happens next in the labor market, because when jobs weaken, everything else follows. If job losses continue to spread and the pace of hiring continues to slow, the effects will become more visible in the broader economy. Wage growth will flatten, the availability of new opportunities will shrink, and households will focus even more on preserving what they already have rather than taking financial risks. This is a natural response to uncertainty, but it also creates an economic environment where growth becomes more difficult to sustain. When individuals and families stop spending and start conserving, the economy begins to cool. Sometimes gradually, sometimes sharply. And that is where the United States currently stands. Consumer sentiment is weakening. Companies are preparing for tighter conditions. Job security is no longer assumed. Inflation is still eating into spending power. And the cost of borrowing remains high. All of these elements together form a financial climate where caution becomes the default mindset. The most concerning aspect of the current situation is that the pressure is not isolated to one area. It is layered. Housing costs have risen. Food prices have risen. Car insurance premiums, electricity bills, healthcare, and basic consumer goods have all become more expensive. At the same time, wage increases have not kept pace with these rising expenses. So even individuals who feel secure in their employment are watching the gap between their income and their expenses shrink. This gradual erosion of financial comfort is one of the primary drivers of declining sentiment. People do not need a formal economic report to tell them what they are already experiencing. They can feel it. And when millions of households feel the same way at the same time, consumer sentiment surveys reflect that reality with unmistakable clarity. A sentiment reading of 50.3 is not just a number. It is a message. It is a signal that households are preparing for more difficult conditions. This preparation is also reflected in conversations happening quietly across the country. Families are reconsidering holiday spending. Young adults are postponing plans to move out of shared housing. Parents are adjusting grocery lists, focusing more on essentials. People are waiting longer to replace aging cars and appliances. Small business owners are delaying expansion or new hiring. These are the microeconomic decisions that accumulate into macroeconomic outcomes. And it is not only households making adjustments. State and local governments are preparing for reduced revenue as consumer spending directly affects sales tax collections. Cities are slowing down infrastructure spending. School districts are reviewing budgets. Hospitals are adjusting staffing. Universities are cutting back on administrative hires. These are institutional responses to the same financial pressures households are experiencing. When both consumers and institutions move into a defensive posture at the same time, the economic system begins to contract. It does not necessarily happen suddenly. It often unfolds step by step. First, sentiment declines, then spending slows. Businesses tighten budgets, hiring freezes follow. Then layoffs accelerate. And once layoffs accelerate, sentiment declines further. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. At this stage, the most important question is whether something will intervene to stabilize confidence. That could come from a meaningful decline in inflation that restores purchasing power. It could come from interest rate adjustments. It could come from policy decisions aimed at stimulating growth. But right now, the conditions required to trigger a strong rebound are not firmly in place. Inflation is still high enough to limit policy flexibility. The job market is cooling, and consumer confidence is weakened. The Federal Reserve is trying to slow the economy without stopping it. They are attempting to reduce inflation without causing a recession. But the longer interest rates stay elevated, the more strain builds, and the pressure does not distribute evenly. It is often felt first among households with lower savings, higher debt, or variable interest payments. It is also felt in small businesses that rely on lines of credit to manage operations. These sectors tend to respond to tightening conditions earlier than larger institutions, and they often experience the impact more intensely. The impact is also visible in behavior related to long-term planning. People are delaying retirement. College enrollment patterns are changing. Workers are holding on to jobs they might once have left voluntarily. The willingness to take risk, whether financial or professional, declines in a climate of uncertainty. And that decline in risk appetite slows innovation, entrepreneurship, and investment. Yet even with these pressures building, the public is not responding with panic. They are responding with caution. They are adjusting. They are preparing. And that is perhaps the most telling detail. Americans are not unaware of what is happening. They are conscious of it. They are watching prices. They are watching layoffs. They are watching political decisions. They are paying attention to their own financial stability. This awareness is part of what is driving this shift in sentiment. It is not emotional. It is rational. People are reacting to what they see and experience. So where does this leave the US economy? At a turning point. The trajectory from here depends heavily on whether confidence can be restored before the slowdown deepens. If inflation eases in a meaningful way and job cuts stabilize, confidence may rebuild. But if layoffs continue to spread and prices remain elevated, consumers will continue to pull back, and the slowdown will intensify. Every economic cycle is shaped by both numbers and psychology. In this moment, psychology is playing a powerful role. People are signaling that they are uneasy. They are signaling that they are adjusting. And they are signaling that they are preparing for more challenging conditions. Right now, American consumers are very nervous. And that nervousness has the potential to ripple through every sector of the economy. What happens next will depend on how businesses respond, how policymakers respond, and how long it takes for households to feel that conditions are improving rather than deteriorating. If you are in the United States, I would like to hear your perspective. Are you seeing higher prices? Are you noticing changes at work? Are people you know talking about job security, budgeting, or financial stress? Share your experience in the comments below. Your voice matters, and it adds real context to the data. Thank you for watching. Remember to show your support. Like, subscribe, and share the video. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.